gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution. And as those of you who have been here so often know, I have the chance every day in this spectacular place, which I think is constitutional heaven, to introduce the greatest minds in the country about the most important issues of the day. But there's no one in the country whose introduction gives me more pleasure than the one that I'm about to tee up tonight. Because I'm not actually introducing Joe, I'm introducing the guy who's introducing Joe. But Joe Torsella means a lot to me on many levels. He's one of my oldest friends. We were buddies in graduate school. He's the most talented political figure and leader of my generation. And he also created this amazing institution that is doing so much to elevate constitutional discourse in America. As you walk up the marble staircase coming up here, the attentive of you will see a plaque. And it's a tribute to Joe. And it says, among other things, as was said of Christopher Wren in St. Paul's Cathedral, if you would see his monument, look around you. And that is the case with the National Constitution Center. As you look around you, both here in this beautiful museum of We the People in Philadelphia, and also in this incredible series of national debate and educational initiatives that the National Constitution Center is engaging in every day, you are seeing a tribute to the vision of Joe Torsella, who is here tonight. So I cannot resist telling you, and I'm just going to take 2 minutes to do it, just some selection of what Joe has created and what he is doing for the Constitution in America. So first there's this incredible Museum of We the People, and as you know, it now contains one of the 12 original copies of the Bill of Rights, and rare copies of the Declaration of Independence, and the first public printing of the Constitution, and an incredible interactive, which is done with Google, where you can trace the spread of liberty across the globe. But then think of all of the events that are about to transform Philadelphia, and the National Constitution Center is central to it. The Pope is coming. We are having an exhibit on religious liberty and rare documents of freedom of religion. The Supreme Court is about to decide the fate of marriage equality, and we are having a special exhibit that examines the evolution of gay rights in the courts. The Democratic Convention is coming to Philadelphia, and we will have a Race to the White House exhibit and a series of national debates about the convention. So whenever there is an issue, this Museum of We the People examines its constitutional dimension. But Joe did not only create the Museum of We the People, he also created America's Town Hall and a Center for Civic Education. I came last night from New York, where we held the first of our series of traveling town hall debates, along with Intelligence Squared. And the question was, does the president have the constitutional power to wage war without congressional authorization? An amazing debate. The week before, in Washington, we launched the first of our debates, co-hosted by the Federalist Society, the leading conservative lawyers organization, and the American Constitution Society, the liberal organization, about the Hobby Lobby case. And we're taking them on the road to San Francisco and Chicago and Boston. And we think it's going to be like the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's going to transform constitutional discourse. Our We the People podcasts are getting 350,000 downloads a month and are distributed by Slate as one of the 12 top podcasts in America. And our civic education initiatives finally are so exciting that we're going to create the best interactive constitution on the web, where leading liberal and conservative scholars describe what they agree about and disagree about for every single clause of the Constitution. So I could go on. This is Joe's night. It's not mine, but I'm giving you this plug because this was what he created. This was his vision. This place would not exist. Did he not? You know, we were both, I don't know, I was 29 at the time or something. We were kids, but he was a kid with a vision and the ability to pull it off. He conceived of this place. He thought that America would be a better place if there was one space where both sides could come together in these polarized times to discuss constitutional issues, not political issues, so citizens can make up their own mind, and he pulled it off. And finally, I'm not supposed to introduce him, but you're about to hear just a whiz-bang, incredibly erudite and useful and insightful lecture about James Wilson, our mutual favorite founder, who conceived of the idea that we, the people of the United States as a whole, were sovereign, not the people of each state, an analysis of the problem of political polarization at the federal level, and an account of why the states, as laboratories of democracy, are better able to address it. So it's an amazing evening. We're so honored that Joe is here, not only as the founder of the Constitution Center, but also as a scholar in residence at Drexel University. And now it's my great honor to introduce a colleague, one of Philadelphia's greatest educational leaders, a man who's a dynamo, who has transformed Drexel and the state of higher education in Philadelphia, and is a great friend of the Constitution Center as well. John Fry was appointed the 14th president of Drexel in 2010. He has transformed Drexel into what has been called the modern urban university of the future. He's also president of the Drexel College of Medicine and Drexel eLearning, where he's created an incredibly state-of-the-art e-learning platform. He's been president of Franklin and Marshall College, executive vice president of the University of Pennsylvania, and as all of you who have encountered him and read about him know, he is a force of nature, an educational visionary, and someone who shares my great love and affection for Chair Torsella. Please join me in welcoming President John Fry.
I actually want Torsella's introduction next time, okay? That was fantastic. Jeff, thank you. You and your colleagues at the National Constitution Center are so excellent at what you do, and I think we just got a small example of that. This is such a compelling place, and it's a real privilege for us to host this university lecture in this magnificent room made possible by the Kirby family, who have been generous to so many institutions like the National Constitution Center. The National Constitution Center, like the Constitution itself, is so evidently necessary that it seems like it should have existed forever, but of course it didn't. All the way back in December 1886, when the committee planning the Constitutional Centennial met for the first time and, among other things, resolved to commission an oration and a poem for the occasion, to organize a military display, to plan an industrial procession, and to invite the President of the United States and foreign dignitaries to a centennial jubilee, the committee also agreed on one more objective, and I quote, "The creation of a suitable memorial in the city of Philadelphia, commemorative of the signing and adoption of the Constitution and the progress of the nation since that period." So now in the 50-page printed program for the centennial, that resolution is the only place the memorial is mentioned. And if you've ever served on a big committee, and most of us had, you understand that the first day is the best day and the most optimistic day. And so like any good idea, the dream of that permanent memorial didn't happen right away, but it also didn't go away. In fact, it was still kicking around 100 years later at the bicentennial celebration in 1987, which was followed by a congressional act authorizing, again, a commemorative institution, but really not much else. And so I would submit that idea might still be kicking around, except, thank God, Joe Torsella came along and actually made it happen, as Jeff explained. So as the founding president of the National Constitution Center, Joe brought the unique background of a businessman who had also been an important voice in city government under Ed Rendell, who was then mayor, and was also a serious student of history and politics, which will be on full display this evening. He has the perfect background and temperament and leadership qualities to launch a museum that would relate to the Constitution, this centuries-old document, to what it means to be a citizen today and in the future. It's the same mix of qualities that make him such an outstanding fit for Drexel as our distinguished visiting fellow for this year. So our university connects the accumulated knowledge and theory of the academy and marries those up with the practical needs of society. We do it through cooperative education, where our students work full-time with partners in industry. We do it through translational research, which develops basic discovery into technologies and ideas that can change the world today. And we also do this by fostering conversations about the issues that shape our civic body, led by experts like Joe Torsella. So for this year, between his outstanding work at the United Nations as the U.S. representative for management and reform, and very excitedly, his potential return to public service at the state level next year, and I will run your transition if you want me to. It's been our wonderful fortune to have Joe working with Drexel students and faculty conducting research and policy exploration, and educating the community through these university lectures. It is a great honor and a privilege to host him at Drexel, and a wonderful thrill to welcome him tonight and introduce to all of you my friend, Ambassador Joe Torsella.
Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, after those two introductions, it's going to be all downhill from here. But let me begin by thanking my great and longtime friend, Jeff Rosen, for that warm welcome in many ways, and by saying how lucky the Constitution Center is to have him here at the helm. I loved every minute of my time in Jeff's job, but in retrospect, I now think of those 10 years as my John the Baptist days. I was just paving the way for Jeff. And I want to thank also my friend, my colleague, and let's be totally honest, my boss, President John Fry, for his kind introduction, for his lifetime of leadership to our state and our region, and for giving me the privilege of spending some time at one of the most dynamic institutions of higher education in the country. And a special shout out to the Drexel board members who are here, among them Chuck Pannoni, two-time acting president of the same institution and good friend. I'm thrilled that the first of these two talks that President Fry asked me to give is being held here at the Constitution Center because it's appropriate to my theme, as you'll see, but also because few things in life feel as good as coming home, which is what this is for me. I'm especially glad to be here, safely tucked inside the Kirby Auditorium, where, for those of you who may remember the center's grand opening, I can be totally, completely confident that absolutely nothing is going to fall on me. I want to talk tonight about the most important three words in our political history, arguably in all of political history, the "We the People" engraved in the limestone of the front of this building. I want to talk about the genius of that idea and its often forgotten author, about why it's in some trouble from trends in our political, social, and economic lives, and about how we can rebuild and reinvigorate that sense of we, and the surprising source for some answers and some optimism. Now first, full disclosure, I'm not a political scientist, an academic, or a scholar. It made my mother really proud to read of my highfalutin Drexel title, but as far as I can tell, the translation for Distinguished Visiting Fellow is not really qualified to teach undergraduates. What I am is someone who's had the extraordinary and accidental privilege of spending a good bit of my life, from my years at this extraordinary institution to my time representing our country at the UN, in one way or another, thinking about America from the inside and the outside. And through all of that, I kept returning to those three simple but astonishing words. Not because there aren't other celebration-worthy parts of our Constitution, there are too many to list. But I want to shine an especially bright light tonight on my nominee for the founders' highest, most unprecedented achievement, the invention of popular sovereignty and a completely new construct of national citizenship. And I want to shine that light on one breakthrough man and one breakthrough moment. Now, the mind of Madison continues to take my breath away. Like his contemporaries, I stand somewhat in awe of General Washington. Truth be told, even standing next to his statue made me a little bit nervous. And I can still somehow feel Alexander Hamilton's pulsing energy across 2.5 centuries. But my favorite founder is one most Americans have never heard of, even though he truly was the Steve Jobs of the Constitutional Convention. James Wilson, Pennsylvanian by way of Scotland, Carlisle, Pennsylvania farmer and brilliant lawyer, one of a handful to sign both the Declaration and the Constitution, and an original justice of the Supreme Court. At the Constitutional Convention, it was Wilson who translated the idea of popular sovereignty that was floating around in the Enlightenment ether into an actual, on-the-ground American political reality. Now, that concept of popular sovereignty sounds commonplace to our ears the way iPhone does to our children because we simply can't imagine a world without it. But the founders lived in such a world. As clear-headed political thinkers, they knew that in every government, ultimate power, sovereignty, had to reside somewhere. But the centuries leading up to 1787 provided only two answers for where that could be. Over most of the globe, sovereignty belonged to monarchs or to autocrats. In a few tiny bright spots, like the British system, sovereignty belonged to a representative body. Wilson's epiphany was to see that even representative bodies were not, like parliaments or legislatures, were not themselves sovereign, that ultimate authority need not reside in any part of government at all, but could rest entirely outside of it, and that a nation could be built on that foundation. As he put it at the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, the truth is that the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable authority remains with the people. I recollect no constitution founded on this principle, but we have witnessed the improvement and enjoy the happiness of seeing it carried into practice. That last sentence is important. When Wilson says, I recollect no constitution founded on this principle, that's 18th century speak for we have done something radically new, and they and he surely did. If Wilson is my nominee for the convention's MVP, my nominee for its highlight reel moment happened sometime in the last days of summer, 1787, between the printing of the working draft of the Constitution on August 6th and the final copy of the Constitution on September 17th. Before there was We the People of the United States, there was something else. Here's how the penultimate printing of the Constitution began. We the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and so on. That's the Constitution we almost had. We were one turn of a printing press away from those words. But sometime during those 5 weeks, and probably at the hand of Gouverneur Morris, another Pennsylvanian, they changed to the more familiar words that are engraved on this building and let's hope in our hearts. Now, for you Colbert Report fans out there, Morris, who had a wooden leg, may be best known to you as the founder who prompted Colbert, when he visited the Constitution Center, to ask me, quote, exactly how many of the founding fathers were pirates? Now, think about that for a moment, not about Colbert. Think about that change in the preamble and to understand its implications. Just imagine if Lincoln had to fight the Civil War under a constitution that began, we the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, etc. Putting this unsung man and this unsung moment together, it was that final change that fully expressed Wilson's great idea. Not just that the people are, as he said, the fountain of government, but defining who those people are as one we, one national American people. That idea is a taproot of our exceptionalism because it created an utterly new paradigm of citizenship, one that isn't based, as most national identities still are, on a shared past, but on an imagined future. Not on common genes, but on common commitments. Not on accidental borders, but on intentional beliefs in which the newest member of our political community is the civic equal of the oldest. Like Wilson, 7 of the 39 men who signed the Constitution were themselves immigrants. To put that number in perspective, there were, as a percentage, more immigrants in that room of framers than there are in all of America today. The vision of citizenship and national community that they put their names to was so spacious, so compelling, so powerful that it made us into civic alchemists, able to take all of history's us's and them's and forge them into one big, beautiful American we, to make a great American unum out of all our diverse human pluribus. Yes, it's been a messy, flawed, and uneven journey, to say the least. It's taken everything from a civil war to a civil rights movement, from suffrage marchers to a 19th Amendment, from Stonewall to marriage equality lawsuits, to move that American we toward the inclusion it promised, and we are by no means done. The story of the Constitution isn't one of perfection descending from heaven. But the genius of what the founders gave us is that even when they and we failed the words themselves always call us back to the ideal. And over time, we have become, as they might have put it, and as one of Washington's successors did put it here in this room, not perfect, but more perfect. Now, in an age when most leaders around the globe profess our democratic values even when they don't practice them, it's sometimes easy to forget how world-changing James Wilson's popular sovereignty, the people part of We the People, really was. But it shouldn't be difficult for any of us to see how revolutionary the other part of his vision, the we part of the clause, remains. 3 years at the United Nations made it crystal clear for me. I remember both watching proudly as the flag of the UN's newest member state, South Sudan, rose over Turtle Bay for the first time, and then later watching sadly as ethnic-based violence slowly consumed the world's newest country. Such conflict over national identity and cohesion is far from unusual, unfortunately, and not just among newer members of the club. How many of us were on the edge of our seats last year wondering whether Scotland and England would divorce after 307 years of political marriage? So I came back from my time at the UN in New York even more convinced than ever that the amazing American idea of a national we, with its unique ability to transcend the divisions that in other places tear nations apart, is truly a treasure. But I also came back to the realization that just at the time the world most needs our idea and example, that concept of we is facing some serious new challenges here at home. One of the most profound, as I'll argue later, is the way we're increasingly dividing ourselves from one another and connecting more and more with people and information that simply reinforce what we already think. These new habits of ours make it easier for our differences to be manipulated rather than mediated in ways that ultimately erode our ability to govern ourselves, to truly serve as the people Wilson intended to make sovereign. To be sure, we are, and we always will be, a long way from our darkest hour or from the darkest examples that I saw at the UN, as a quick trip to Gettysburg would remind and reassure any of us. Nevertheless, the American we, our own sense of being what Wilson called, quote, one great community, is becoming badly frayed. It's most obvious, I think, in our national politics, where we are more divided than ever. As a National Journal headline last year put it, it's official. We have, quote, the most divided Congress ever, at least until next year, end quote. According to the political scientists who measure these things, the divide in Congress has gotten steadily worse since about 1970, so that Congress is now more polarized than at any time since the end of Reconstruction. If this polarization was limited to just one house of one branch of one government, we could relax. But there's evidence that polarization is happening in state capitals too, and in our households. In one memorable statistic from a Pew Foundation study last year, 30% of committed conservatives said they'd be unhappy if a family member married a Democrat, and 23% of committed liberals said the same thing about marrying a Republican. Here's where I should confess, by the way, that I am a proud, lifelong Democrat, happily married to a proud, lifelong Republican, with happy in-laws all around, as far as I know. But party politics is just one part of the story. What should also worry us is how many other graphs over the same period look a lot like this one. Nowhere is that clearer than in income inequality, where the gap between the richest and the poorest Americans has become wider and wider to a degree we haven't seen since the 1920s. Average family income for the majority of Americans has barely budged in real terms in the 45 years since 1970, while the very richest of us are, by one estimate, making 240% more over roughly the same period. In the 1970s, the average CEO made between 20 and 30 times what the average worker made. The Harvard Business School tells us that figure is now over 300 times. There's a different sort of chart about money that's worth noting here as well. Over the same period that political polarization and income inequality in America have spiked, so too has the amount of money in politics, especially since recent Supreme Court decisions dismantling much of what was left of campaign finance restrictions. And while the money has been flowing, our ability to draw on a common narrative has been ebbing. The decline of network news viewership is almost a mirror image of those other graphs and a good proxy for understanding how fragmented our media landscape has become, with 600 cable channels and 26 million blogs to yesterday's 3 networks and community newspapers of record. We all may or may not be better informed, but we are all very differently informed. Many of us are now living, as Princeton's Paul Starr says, in our own factual universes. To those visual alarms, I'd add a few others that are harder to draw charts for, but just as important. I'd start with the reminders that the news regularly gives us about our unfinished business on race in America and the distance we still have to go to fully realize the dream we say we aspire to every Martin Luther King Day. Or the fact that it's been nearly 30 years since Congress last tackled comprehensive immigration overhaul, despite calls for it from presidents as different as George W. Bush and Barack Obama, which is not just a measurement of congressional dysfunction, but also a measure of something even more vital, something like the state of our national soul, whether we remain committed to the boldest, most successful definition of citizenship the world's ever seen. My point is that all these problems are connected to each other and to a larger and more dangerous problem. In many ways, the capital W American we haven't been drawing closer together, but in fact growing farther apart. It's not just that our national politics are polarized, or that we can't come together on an immigration policy, or that the gap between rich and poor has widened. It's that both the sense and reality of us being one American family is under some severe strain. So recommitting ourselves to Wilson's vision, to rebuilding all the roads and bridges that used to connect his one great community, should be our urgent priority. But before we can rebuild, we have to understand exactly where all the old roads and bridges failed. And the best place to start is with a closer look at that first graph we saw about political polarization. What's puzzling is that over the same time period where divisions in Congress are skyrocketing, some fundamentals about the American public are barely changing. Over those years, about the same proportion of Americans considered themselves as Democrats or Republicans. Americans' views on many key hot-button issues haven't really changed much. The percentage of Americans calling themselves liberal, conservative, or moderate isn't dramatically changing. So how on earth do all those steady lines in the American public lead to that ugly graph in Congress? The first key is that whatever we want to say about Washington, polarization is probably the wrong term for what's happening in the country. Polarization would literally mean we're all becoming more extreme in our views, moving to the poles on a spectrum. Some of this is going on, but the bigger trend is that we're becoming more sorted. Our views aren't changing so much as we are more and more grouping ourselves with people who think just as we do. In the political arena, this sorting means the ideological composition of our parties has changed, so that the average Democrat in Congress, or in this audience for that matter, thinks more like every other Democrat, and the average Republican thinks more like every other Republican than was true just a few decades ago when there were more Democrats who thought, at least on some issues, like Republicans, and vice versa. And in our broader national life, sorting also means we are rearranging ourselves in ways that go well beyond politics. A few years ago, when he was chairman of the Constitution Center, President Clinton recommended that all of us here read an important book called The Big Sort by former journalist Bill Bishop. Bishop says that our old American love affair with mobility is colliding with a cornucopia of technology and choice to let us segregate ourselves into what he calls communities of like-mindedness, in where we live, where we play, where we get our news, even where we worship. We're congregating more and more with those who share our views or circumstances, and therefore less and less able to understand those who don't. Two examples. One, in the Carter-Ford election of 1976, a close 1 percentage point election, only 25% of America lived in so-called landslide counties, counties that went for one candidate or the other by more than 20%. By the Kerry-Bush election of 2004, decided by the same 1 percentage point nationally, almost 1/2 of Americans lived in landslide counties. Second example, in 1976, Americans with college degrees were spread across the country's metropolitan areas pretty evenly. By 2004, those college degrees had flocked to some areas and nearly abandoned others. The percentage in Austin, for example, was 45%, but only 14% in Cleveland. And in general, rural America had half the percentage of college graduates as urban America. So you can see how sorting explains something about our widening sense of divides, economic, cultural, and political. It's clearly both reflected in our politics and often exploited by our politicians, in part by the relentless gerrymandering of the political map into safe districts that make primaries more important than general elections and mean that most incumbents of both parties are reelected. This sorting is not a small issue, but it's different than the false idea that all of us are somehow and inexplicably becoming more radical in our views. The second key is to understand who participates in American politics, who doesn't, and what that means for us. That Pew report I mentioned has been, in my view, wildly misinterpreted. From the headlines, you would think that we're all becoming much more extreme partisans. True, the number of Americans who have totally consistent views, either liberal or conservative, has doubled, but from 10% to 21%, which means, if I'm doing the math right, that about 80% of America still lives somewhere in the problem-solving center. It really is true, as President Obama once said, that we are not as divided as our politics suggests. But the 21% living closer to the polls votes and contributes and participates in every way much more frequently than the 79%. Those who are down-the-line liberals are only 13% of the population, but 58% of them are likely to vote. Those who are down-the-line conservatives are just 9% of the population, but 78% of them are likely to vote. But of the nearly 40% of the population who have mixed political views, only 39% are likely to vote. Add to that math the fact that there's a consistent gap in voter turnout of about 15% between higher and lower income voters. So, putting aside whatever political views you hold, ask yourself whether you want a country where elections are determined by the most partisan or most affluent voters of either party. And then ask yourself, when you combine those facts with the tsunami of money we saw earlier, along with, at last count, the 23 lobbyists for every single elected representative, what kind of Congress you're likely to get. A paralyzed, beholden, hyper-partisan, and dysfunctional one, which is the third key here. I said a while back that the National Journal called the last Congress the most polarized in history. That's a dubious title, but it's not a shameful one. What is a shameful title was another award the 113th Congress got. Runner-up for, quote, least productive Congress in modern history. So when, despite the individual service of good men and women, Congress as an institution can't do much of anything except rename post offices, Americans award it with an approval rating of, when I last checked, 18%. A political consultant friend of mine puts this much more colorfully. Congress, he told me a few months ago, polls about as well these days as head lice. I mentioned earlier that polarization has been creeping into state legislatures, about half of which are now actually more polarized than Congress. But Americans give their state legislatures much higher grades than their federal government in general, and than Congress in particular. Approval ratings of state governments, currently around 57%, have been relatively high for years. Interestingly, both Republicans and Democrats give their states high marks, and the states with divided political control, which in Washington has not been a pretty picture, actually get the highest marks from their citizens. That tells us that it's not congressional polarization per se that troubles most Americans or should worry us. It's congressional gridlock and bad behavior. Americans don't expect their elected officials to lack convictions. They do expect them, however, to prefer solving problems to running on them, to represent all their constituents and not merely a few, and to regularly compromise in the American interest, which explains some of the difference in our feelings toward our state capitals and our national one. As many states show, there is no inherent reason why a polarized, politically sorted legislative body can't also be an effective one if there's a seat in the chamber for the value of principled compromise. That value is what's in especially short supply on Capitol Hill these days. The consultant friend I just quoted has a political hero, the great 19th century senator and Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. Clay, whom Lincoln himself once called his, quote, beau ideal of a statesman, was known as the Great Compromiser. My friend points out that in Clay's era, that title was a badge of honor. In today's Congress, it would invite the formation of a super PAC to run negative campaign ads in the next primary. That would concern James Wilson deeply, because his Constitution wasn't designed to either magnify or to eliminate political conflict, but to manage it. Let's not forget that at the national level, we were, in a sense, born into an argumentative family. The Rhode Island delegation walked out of the Constitutional Convention. Large numbers of Americans, the Anti-Federalists, agreed with them. And high-stakes political conflict has been with us since the Washington administration. What's different in Washington, D.C. now is our inability to resolve those conflicts productively. Remember also that the Anti-Federalists were not exactly crushed. Out of that fight we got a Bill of Rights. So what we really have are three connected problems. First, we're sorting ourselves in ways that make it harder for us to remember that we are all Americans and easier for politicians to play on our differences. Second, it's not really we the people who are picking our representatives these days. It's we the most partisan and we with the biggest political checkbooks. And third, the institution to which the founders devoted the most parchment and ink, which most embodied their hopes for a venue where clashing interests would be mediated, the Congress, is badly broken. And that breakage, in turn, prevents national action on issues like the growing economic divide or immigration, or even the crumbling of the infrastructure that literally connects us, that further corrode our sense of we. So we have three solutions, of which the first is to reform Congress. It would take another lecture or three to do justice to this topic. But my list would start with redistricting reform so that voters choose their representatives instead of politicians choosing their voters. Reforming the filibuster in the Senate, at least by making senators do it the way Mr. Smith did. And requiring Congress to work on a schedule that would look a little more like the one most working Americans keep. Instead of a 3-day work week, if Congress people spent 3 full weeks each month in Washington, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, it would dramatically increase the odds that members might get to know one another, maybe understand one another, and maybe even start to work with one another. Second, we need a sustained effort to both increase political participation and decrease the influence of money. It is very hard for me to reconcile the stories told in the exhibits here of extraordinary sacrifice over generations to fully realize our freedoms with the fact that only 36% of eligible Americans voted in last November's midterms. That trend led me, when I had Jeff's job, to write an essay asking why we still vote on Tuesdays. A lot of us probably think that Tuesday voting is somewhere in the Constitution. It isn't. It's a relic of an agrarian America where Wednesday was market day, Sunday the Sabbath, and most people needed Monday to travel to a far-off courthouse to cast their ballots on Tuesday. Tuesday voting made sense in 1815. It makes no sense in 2015, especially when voter turnout hits, as it just did, a 72-year low, and 25% of non-voters cite work as a reason they can't get to the polls. So it's time to look at every alternative, from voting on a national holiday, to weekend voting, to extended hours, to expanding early voting, to mail-in voting, to same-day registration, that would durably expand our voting participation while duly safeguarding the integrity of the process. And while we're at it, we should look at open primaries, top 2 primaries, instant runoff voting, and a new generation of campaign finance reform so that it really will be we the people, and not just we the well-funded or we the hyper-partisan, who will elect our representatives. Third, we need a creative and massive effort to find new ways to unsort ourselves. I said that a sorted America is not the same as a truly polarized America, but the problem is it could eventually lead us there. As the great quote from Learned Hand reminds us, the spirit of liberty, he said, is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. Have dinner with a group of friends who agree with every single word you say, and then ask yourself if the spirit of liberty will thrive in a sorted America. I grew up in the small Pennsylvania town of Berwick, population 12,274 in 1970, the first year of all those charts. My grandfather, who ran a junkyard, went to the same church as a relative of his who owned a car dealership. My uncle, who was a factory welder, went hunting with his dentist. My father, the son of an immigrant, marched in parades with descendants of the men who industrialized the town in the 19th century. And I remember trying to predict the outcome of that 1976 election by counting the signs and bumper stickers in our neighborhood, and they were so evenly divided that I really couldn't tell whether we'd elect Jimmy Carter, a leader for a change, or whether Gerald Ford would, quote, make us proud again. Now, we know from Bill Bishop that most of us no longer live in places like Berwick, 1970, anymore. We can't turn back the clock, but what we can do is intentionally create new kinds of communities, if not on the ground, then in other ways, to do what growing up in Berwick did for me, make me realize that I was part of an American whole with more mutual obligations and less certain answers than I thought. If the quintessentially American trait of mobility has given us the big sort, then we need to deploy that other quintessentially American trait of ingenuity to find ways to give ourselves the big reshuffle. One of the answers is under our feet, literally. To its credit, and the credit of the people who lead it, the Constitution Center is the American capital of civil, rational discourse, not crossfire, but conversation between people with different points of view. It is profoundly encouraging that the Constitution Center's podcasts are now the second most popular of the 700,000 in their category. It tells us there is a deep hunger for conversations that cross the picket fences we've erected in sordid America, and that this place really has become America's town hall. And that's great, but we need hundreds, thousands of these kinds of spaces in America. I may get fired from the board here for diluting the Constitution Center's franchise, but in the absence of action in Washington on the things like an expanded program of national service, for example, that might reintroduce us sordid Americans to each other at a macro level, I want to challenge American civil society to ask what it could do, like the Constitution Center, to help sort us less and shuffle us more at the micro level. I don't pretend to know all the answers, but I do know it's a question that every American institution should be asking. To my colleagues in the admissions office at Drexel, for example, I'd relay a recent conversation I had with a university our son applied to, where they explained how he'd be precisely matched with a roommate who would share his interests, his temperament, his preferences. That might be a great thing for our son, but it is clearly a bad thing for our son's generation. I'd ask President Fry to think about that disproportionate pattern of where college graduates settle, how that connects to patterns of economic inequality, and what our colleges and universities might do to change that. I'd ask the young innovators in Drexel's new College of Computing and Informatics to think about how to use technology and social media to connect us in new kinds of communities, not with those who already share our views and interests, but precisely with those who don't. And I'd issue a special challenge here to our philanthropic sector, which has done an impressive job of chronicling our descent into a balkanized and partisan media landscape, to play a much bolder role in reshaping that landscape by actually building better alternatives and funding at meaningful scale truly nonpartisan, fact-based national and local media alternatives that build our sense of community. Finally, as I suggested earlier, whatever we do to knit ourselves back together politically has to be accompanied by an equally determined effort to close the economic gap between the richest and the poorest Americans, and to recommit ourselves to an expansive and open sense of citizenship and immigration. Now, the bad news is you can search Washington for the kinds of initiatives I'm proposing and find very few signs of hope. But the good news is this: there's another landscape that is full of hopeful signs, that points the way forward, and that can ultimately determine what will happen in Washington. For almost every problem I've talked about tonight, there's an example of a potential solution already at work somewhere in what the great Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis called the laboratories of democracy, the 50 American states. Let's start with income inequality. Congress hasn't been able to act to raise the minimum wage in almost 10 years, but 29 states have on their own, and they are every color in our political palette: 8 red, 17 blue, and 4 purple. Now, recall that I'm the Democrat in my marriage, so to my mind, raising the minimum wage is both a no-brainer and only a small piece of the income puzzle. But maybe some of you are thinking that my lens or my list is too blue. But I'd bet we would both applaud what's happening in red state Tennessee or purple state Nevada. If you live in Tennessee, you can renew your auto tags at a discount if you open up a college savings account for your child. And if you're a low-income family, you can get a 4-to-1 match on the first $100 you deposit into that account, thanks to an effort led by a Republican state official. If you live in Nevada, you're in the first state in the nation where every child entering kindergarten will have an automatic college savings account, thanks to an effort led by a Democratic state official. That's exciting because studies tell us that even when you control for family income and educational levels, a kid who has a savings account that says college, even of a few $100s, is 4 times more likely to go to and graduate college than a kid who doesn't. And the lifetime earnings differential between those 2 kids approaches $1 million. Think about what scaling up those kinds of efforts could do for our income gap, and I think you'll agree with me that on this issue, the real color of those 2 states is the color of possibility. Congress hasn't been able to act on immigration reform in nearly 30 years, but consider what's happening in state capitals. True, we've seen fireworks and headlines from a handful of states like Arizona and Alabama, but I am more impressed with the far greater number of states who've passed immigrant-friendly laws recently, with the 18 states, 8 blue, 9 red, and 1 purple, who've officially partnered with a national nonprofit to welcome new immigrants into their communities, and with the bipartisan coalition in red state Utah that passed in 2011 a balanced package of both enforcement and benefit measures, exactly the kind of compromise that has eluded Congress. Or consider the things I talked about to increase the participation and power of we the people, or to reform Congress. 9 states already have some form of redistricting other than simply letting legislators draw their districts. 19 states already have some form of open primaries, and California's recent and bold experiment with a top 2 system is showing promising signs of early success. Campaign finance reform may be on life support in Washington, but it's alive and kicking in the states, 16 of which have passed resolutions denouncing the Citizens United ruling. 25 states have some aspect of a voluntary public funding system in place, ranging from quite modest to very ambitious, like Connecticut's clean election system, used by 70% of that state's legislators and defended by Republicans and Democrats alike. And there are exciting innovations underway, like the one in New York City, that focus less on keeping big money out and more on drawing new, smaller donors in. Yes, we've seen misguided efforts to make it harder for more Americans to vote, but we're also seeing a raft of innovations that could make it easier. The Brennan Center at NYU estimates that modernized voter registration, electronic, convenient, portable, could add 50 million Americans to the voting rolls and save millions of dollars. They also tell us that 45 states have implemented at least some aspects of their plan. 12 states today offer Election Day registration, which can by itself increase turnout by 10%. There are even pending proposals in Arizona, Georgia, Hawaii, New York, and Oregon to automatically register eligible citizens to vote unless they opt out. I could go on, but you get the picture. It is not a picture of 50 states marching towards some bipartisan nirvana, but it is a picture where solutions are being born in nearly every state, and in most states we're still able to manage, not wave away, but manage our differences better than we have in Washington. I'll leave it to the political scientists to explain why that's so. My own view and experience is that it has something to do with that sorting factor that I talked about. Many state capitals are still places that are more like Berwick than Washington, still places that demand real interaction among people of diverging views and interests, still places where, try as we may, it is simply harder to stay sorted. What all of this suggests is that if we truly want to knit our American we more closely together again, most of the answers, most of the action, most of the path forward, most of the possibilities and the hope is currently at the state level, which is where we should focus our attention and our efforts first, because that's where we can change much of what needs changing. Because until we've made some changes there, little is likely to change in Washington. And because, as always in American history, when we've changed enough in the states, change in Washington will assuredly follow. So I end with a great irony. I am fundamentally optimistic that we can restore James Wilson's vision of we the people of the United States. But I believe it'll take action through we the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and 47 others to do it. The irony would not have been lost on James Wilson. This towering figure spent his last years professionally disappointed and publicly humiliated, fleeing creditors and occasionally in prison. He deserves to be remembered with the likes of Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, and Washington, but rarely is. As I argue in my title, we owe him more. Yes, we ought to restore him to his proper place in the American pantheon, but I think Wilson himself would care less about his own reputational fate than the fate of his experiment. Our debt to him is much more profound. We owe it to Wilson to recommit ourselves to his idea of we, that we are indeed one great American community. We owe it to Wilson to be as audacious and daring in solving the problems keeping us from fully becoming that as he was in making us that in the first place. You could say the agenda I've sketched out tonight is wildly ambitious and challenging. But can you really say that with a straight face just a few hundred yards from where 55 delegates created a constitution? Could we really say to James Wilson that our relatively modest task of reforming Congress is greater than his of creating it? That resorting ourselves in 2015 is harder than creating one nation out of 13 independent states in 1787? That meaningfully increasing our political participation or creating a more inclusive prosperity are more intractable problems than the invention of popular sovereignty itself or the creation of a national economy in the first place? What we owe James Wilson most of all in the face of our current challenges is to hear again and hear clearly what he told us about our own responsibility and power, ours, not Washington's. We have, as he said, quote, supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable power. What we, the people of the United States, owe James Wilson and ourselves now is to use it. Thank you.
Superb. It's just such a great talk. It is rigorous, it is creative, it's original, and it's inspiring.
Let's stop there.
You have identified, first of all, the most important constitutional ideal of America's most significant but overlooked founder, James Wilson, this idea of the national sovereignty of we the people of the United States. You've talked about the biggest problem in our constitutional politics today, which is the fact that the ability to be united and to compromise is threatened by polarization at the federal level, and then you've identified the states as possible solutions to that. So this is an important talk. And I have a bunch of questions because I think that this discussion that you've initiated is one that we need to continue across the country, and there's some great questions here as well. So I want to start with the obvious question. How did you become interested in James Wilson?
Well, it started when I was here. And I think some of it was due to sort of my Philadelphia sense that we have a lot of stories here that are overlooked. But Wilson, in some ways, kind of captured my imagination because it seemed to me as we were putting this place together that if we're being honest, that really he should have the title Father of the Constitution. I'm not sure, I mean, I could make an argument for Madison. I could make a much better argument for Wilson, who was much more active, or as active in the Constitutional Convention, who had what to me is truly the big idea, and felt like his story hasn't been told well enough. For reasons, I'm not sure why that is. I think some of it has to do with the way that he ended his life. Some of it has to do with the fact that unlike some other founders, he never became president. Some of it has to do, I think, with the fact that maybe it is easier to grasp the idea of the Great Compromise as opposed to this idea of popular sovereignty. But for whatever reason, he captured my imagination. And in many ways, everything about this place was sort of built on a Wilsonian vision, because it ultimately is about this idea of popular sovereignty and inviting people into that, and inviting them, as I just did at the end of that, to remember what that means about their obligation. So as a long-term project, one of the things I hope the Constitution Center does is continue to find ways to tell the Wilson story and spread the word a little better. Maybe we need to commission a good biography of him, or maybe even better, a miniseries. But in any case, I'd like to see more about him.
Or a rap musical.
That's working for Hamilton?
It's working for Hamilton.
Right.
And as we know, Joe and I share an extreme affection for the musical 1776, and Wilson was maligned in that show. I mean, he was viewed as a sort of bumbling fool, whereas just by pure coincidence, he's also my favorite founder, because on my first day in law school, our mutual friend Akhil Amar, who's the fellow of the National Constitution Center, told me Wilson is more significant than Madison because he had the vision that ultimately Lincoln would embrace, and realized that because we, the people of the United States and not of the individual states, were sovereign, secession was unconstitutional, and it took Lincoln to perfect Wilson's vision. So Akhil challenged me to champion Wilson, and you're doing it too, and by God, we're going to bring him back.
All right. Sign them all up.
Let's talk about this fascinating contrast you have between polarization at the federal and state level. I was struck first by your observation that even though state legislatures are just as polarized as Congress, they have much higher approval ratings and they seem to work better. Why is that?
So it's an interesting and complicated story. For a long while, there was a view before this was clear, before all legislatures were measured, that the states were perhaps not polarizing. But now there's all this interesting data that says, in fact, states are, and some are more polarized. In fact, about half, as I said, are more polarized than Congress, and about half less. And there doesn't seem to be any good explanation for which ones fall into which category. You can look at this and come to a couple of conclusions. One conclusion is that, in the extreme case, when you have sort of a state where one party is wholly in control, people may nevertheless be giving their legislature high marks because it's getting things done. But the general view seems to be that states, for all that they are reflecting the same sorting that's happening, nevertheless are able to work through it in a better way, in a far better way than Washington does. Now, you could probably, if you had a panel with a state legislator, I think it would depend on what day of the week whether they would agree with that or not. But the odds are, Harrisburg has gotten more polarized as well, is experiencing some of the same sorting. But the odds are that we're all going to read in a few weeks, or a few months, that Harrisburg will have passed a budget, as it has done most years. What's different is that in states, we are still able to work through those issues, and I think a lot of that has to do with there still being an ability to compromise, even when people hold very different views. I think some of it, frankly, probably has to do with that some of the influences I talked about in Washington of this tremendous volume of money and all the political pressure that comes with that, it has not yet fully made its way to state legislatures. I think some of it probably has to do with the fact, and this is hard for me to say as a lifelong proponent of transparency, I think some of it has to do with the fact that there's probably less that there is, as someone said, sort of, in certain political circles, an outrage industry. I think it's easier for some state legislators to escape that a little bit than it is for folks in Congress. So I think those are some of the reasons that account for the difference. And I suppose if you're being very pessimistic, you could say they're just late in catching up. But I don't think that's true. I think structurally, Congress, something is uniquely dysfunctional with Congress. I don't think, for example, that we have a crisis of political institutions in the United States. There was an article in Foreign Affairs recently, a cover story, the premise of which with which I do not agree, but the title was "See America, Land of Decay and Dysfunction." The illustration, tellingly, was not of a state capitol, a town hall, even the White House or a corporate headquarters. The illustration was of a crumbling Capitol Hill. I think we have a uniquely bad problem with Congress, and it is the confluence of money, of the fact that only 36% of us vote, of the fact that to some degree I think national politics has exploited our sorting more than any other level of politics. And I think it will remain the case that states will be more effective than Washington.
All of that makes sense. I had the great experience of moderating an Aspen Institute seminar of state officials, and they were more optimistic about government than any federal officials I'd met for just the reasons you said. And they confirmed that lack of transparency, the fact that the media wasn't looking at everything, allowed them to compromise more, and I think money made a difference too. But that leads me to ask, when you propose all the great solutions that the states have come up with, from open primaries to easier voter registration to blue ribbon redistricting, is that a solution to polarization or to the lack of compromise? And has it started to work yet in the states or not yet?
Well, I think they're two different issues with, to some sense, the same outcome. So I think they're all worth pursuing. I think the lack of compromise is something that is a cultural question that should get some attention. And by the way, I mostly blame Congress, but I also think the fault is not only in our stars; it's some of it is in us. There's some interesting polling data that says even those of us who say we support compromise, we support it often in the abstract. But then we don't want our politicians to compromise when it comes to our issues. But I do think culturally there's the question of compromise. And there was an interesting lecture by another Constitution Center board member, Larry Kramer, the Roberts lecture a month or so ago, where he made the case that really compromise is a core constitutional value and should be understood as such. And that's what's troubling about the state of play in Washington today. Some of the other things that I talked about, and I want to come back to the sort of whole menu, but some of the other things I talked about are specifically, though, to raise the level. To me, one of the Wilson quotes that is marvelous that I did not use is that Wilson famously called popular sovereignty the great panacea to human politics. And I don't mean that, and I don't think he meant that trivially. I think for most of the things I talked about tonight, popular sovereignty is in fact the panacea. If we had a country where 80% of us voted in the last midterm elections, and if we had a country where we demanded that redistricting be done differently, or demanded changes in how we, the truly astonishing levels of money that's swashing around in politics these days, we would have a different Congress. We wouldn't be pointing at a dysfunctional Congress or a dysfunctional Washington. So to me, raising the level of political participation is, as Wilson might have said, a panacea, and I think will mitigate a lot of what we perceive as polarization coming from Washington.
I have so much more to ask. I want to ask the audience questions, but I do have to ask one constitutional question. Madison, of course, feared faction most. The idea that a group of intensely interested people not devoted to the public good would have majorities would crush minorities, or vice versa, that active minorities would thwart the will of the majority. His solution was to extend the sphere, and a large federated republic where he thought it would be harder for factions to solve. But you said the states are the solution, so was Madison wrong?
Well, far be it from me to contradict James Madison, but I do think he'd be troubled by what he would see, and I don't think the premise of extending the sphere was wrong. I think we have a very peculiar set of things that has happened over, as I argued, the last 30 or 40 years. That have created kind of unique dysfunction in Washington. I mean, there are large states that function well and small states that function well. I think that issue sort of becomes beside the point. There's an interesting take out there now that a lot of what we're seeing in Washington, the problems come from the fact that the parties have evolved into parliamentary-style parties in a checks and balances democracy, where by definition it's already hard to do things, which is a development Madison surely didn't foresee.
Great. Okay, there are several excellent Wilson questions, and here's one. One aspect of Wilson's vision for popular sovereignty, an aspect he mentioned on a number of occasions, is his contention that the people have the right, presumably outside Article 5, to change their constitutions whenever and however they choose. Your thoughts?
Who asked that question? Raise your hand.
It's a great one.
Well, here are my thoughts on that. What I take from your question is we can sort of bemoan the state of play, or when it comes to things like campaign finance, or we could talk about let's propose a constitutional amendment. It's been done before. It hasn't been done recently, with a fairly sort of small bore exception. But I noticed that in my own thinking about this, I often, it's easy to become pessimistic, particularly when you think about the campaign finance issue. And I don't want to, I'm very much a realist. I want to live in the land of the possible, so I'm looking at what's happening now in the landscape that kind of gets around the immovable objects that currently exist, particularly on that issue. But at the same time, I think it is a failure of our political imagination that we're unwilling to think about amending the Constitution. There's, I don't know if it's still there, but in the Signers Hall here in the Constitution Center, there's a wonderful quote up on the wall which says, to paraphrase, there's no reason for us to presume that the people who come after us will be less wise and good, and they should have the ability to amend their Constitution as they see fit. I think what I loved about my time here is this is an extraordinary document, an extraordinary experiment, but it isn't and was never intended to be perfect. What it was intended to do was call out the perfect in us and to have us work harder and harder to get there. So I think there are very much places where we should entertain constitutional amendments. I don't want to talk about outside the process, but...
Well, this next question is pressing you to be specific. Are there amendments to the Constitution that should be made? If so, what should they be? I'll just ask point blank. If you had to draft a single amendment, perhaps to address some of the problems that you talked about today, what would it be?
Well, I think the answer to that will depend on, would depend on how the Supreme Court rules on the redistricting case that's now taken up, which may make some of the examples I just gave moot. But I suspect if I could wave a wand and draft one and have it adopted, it would be, in fact, on how we finance campaigns. What's fascinating, by the way, about that issue, and I hope this came out in some of the slides about the state solutions, there actually is an enormous amount of agreement between Democrats and Republicans on this issue. There's a poll done that I saw that asked both Republicans and Democrats to rate the various factors that they think influenced their congressional representatives' vote. And it was literally the same percentage for Republicans and Democrats who ranked the issue highest, essentially campaign contributions. Lowest was their conscience and the views of their district. But identical between, or within a point or two between Republicans and Democrats. Very similar views among, in polling data between Republicans and Democrats in the country, not necessarily those who are in power at the moment in Washington, on this issue of campaign finance, and a sense that the game has become more and more rigged. So again, that's another, I tried to show, and what I hoped to show with some of those state examples was not that here is the whole of the prescription, but here are the elements. We don't need to wait for a deus ex machina. There are elements working all around the country in all 50 states, all of which we ought to look at, which, by the way, is very much a Constitution Center sort of story. I mean, every great idea in the Constitution had a road test at the state level. Some bad ideas did too, but there was this, there's this period of great constitutional ferment and experimentation from which the framers drew on. And we've lived through this in our history before, in the progressive era, where much was happening in the states that later became adapted in Washington.
I love the fact you quoted Louis Brandeis, my hero, on laboratories of democracy. And Brandeis believed so strongly that it was only in small-scale communities that people could develop their faculties and educate themselves enough for the self-government that was necessary for economic and political democracy. Was that idealistic, or does that resonate with what you're seeing at the state level?
Well, I think it probably does resonate, and he's been a hero of mine as well. I will tell you that I've often thought that laboratories of democracy phrase, through overuse, had sort of lost its relevance for me. But it came back to me in thinking about this topic, and I sort of have new respect for his conclusion. When I started, I knew I wanted to think about this idea of our we and the state of our we. And I really did. Quite a lot about being at the UN made me appreciate afresh how precious that was. But I did not have any idea that I would sort of end up thinking that the ironic way of restoring Wilson's vision that we have is through the states. So I ended up hearing that quote about laboratories of democracy with new ears and newly appreciative ears, thinking Brandeis was really onto something. And by the way, the other point to make about the laboratories is it's not the case that we're going to have 50 states going in the same direction, and that's okay. I mean, there as we know from the newspapers today, there's quite a different variety of governance in our 50 states. But this is how we can work through things, and this is how we can navigate and negotiate between different visions that we have and how they will ultimately play out on the national level. You'll see certain states going in very different directions than others, and that's fine too. What I think is important is that we look carefully at that landscape, and instead of looking at Washington and being discouraged, that we in fact look at Washington, become inspired, and go to our state capitals to try and do something about it.
It's a great vision. On the topic of social segregation, to what degree do market factors and principles of capitalism promote this sort of sorting and segregation? Well,
that's a good question. I don't know the full answer to that. I think Bill Bishop, the author of The Big Sort, would probably suggest that that's not really the driving issue. I think if he were here, and since he's not here, I can speak for him. I think if he were here, he would say that there have always been market forces. We've always been a capitalist country, and that we nevertheless, something unique is happening now that hasn't been happening before, or at least what's happening now is happening much more aggressively, much more speedily, possibly much more irrevocably than before. And I don't think it's the case that it's simply economic forces driving it. I think he would also argue that a lot of sorting has happened kind of without our deliberate intention. That it's not us trying to escape other points of view. It's happening because we are and always will be a sort of mobile people, and we have all of this choice and ability now that we haven't always had, and technology. I often say to my son, who is an exceptionally smart and all-around wonderful young man, he's incredibly well informed, but he's informed in ways that reinforce the things he already knows. That it's a lot harder for him to run into knowledge or people who may differ from the things he knows than it was for the two of us by virtue of the choices that we didn't have. So this sounds a little, I think, crankish of me to suggest we should go back to 3 networks and one big newspaper in each city. But what I do want us to think about is whether there are ways of kind of recreating the enforced community that things like that represented, which is that you come face to face with people and views that aren't the ones that you already have, and that in a democracy is absolutely not just a healthy thing, it's absolutely an essential thing. One of the other points I want to make on this sorting is I didn't do a call out in the various ones I did to Drexel, but I should, to Provost Herbert, that there is a mountain of literature on the fact that we're becoming polarized, or more properly, I think, sorted. And there is almost nothing on what we might do about that. So we ought to turn, going back to the Bill Bishop point, I think one of the striking things is he thinks a lot of this has happened kind of without us even thinking about it. Now that we're thinking about it, now that we've noticed it, now that we, I hope, think about its particularly dangerous implications for the constitutional enterprise, one of the things the Academy and places like the Constitution Center ought to do is think intentionally about what we can do about it, because I refuse to believe that the answer is nothing.
Well, I want to end with a call to action, because it is such an important question. And one of our questioners asks, in your view, what issue or event may mitigate, or we the people, or cause them to reverse the sort of trend dynamic that you so eloquently described? And I'll just tell us more specifically what the Constitution Center can do, what the country can do, and what the audience can do to end the big sort and to restore the American we.
Great ending question. What the Constitution Center can do is what it's doing, but do it more. What everyone in the audience should do is think about those questions that I asked of Drexel. I think that, we like to tell ourselves that, that we have a problem in Washington, Washington can solve the problem. That's for me, the fundamental lesson of everything that happened here in 1787 is that's not the case at all. It is up to us. So I think every American institution should make a little time as it's thinking about its own mission, but a little more time to think about the American mission, and to think what it can do about this set of problems, whether that's a company, whether that's a university, whether that's a nonprofit, whether it's a family. And if we do that, I refuse to believe that the answer to this question is that we can't figure it out. I believe we can, and I believe we will. The third part to my answer is, I think the most important thing that I talked about in some ways is changing the nature of our political participation so that the act of voting is not something, to me it really is an appalling indictment of all of us. And by which I mean the way we've let things, the state we've let things get to. That we reached a 72-year low in voter turnout in the last midterm elections. So the third thing that I think all of us ought to do is figure out how to make that our cause, and in our own individual lives and networks, do everything we can to change that. Because, ending where I started, I think Wilson was right. We are the panacea, and we are the solution to this problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, for his contributions to elevating the quality of American discourse throughout his career and today, please join me in thanking the great Joe Torsella.
Thank you. That was fun.